to give you a sense of what that means, your average 200-page novel is about 75,000 words. How this million words happens is that I write a lot of fan fiction for fun and to explore topics and properties that I'm interested in. I also do a ton of essays about pop culture, and I work as a media analyst. My day job actually involves being paid to write about how the news tells stories about different types of people and different types of companies. So the sort of unifying thing in everything I do, whether I'm writing Harry Potter fan fiction or I'm writing something for an anthology, is I tell stories about how people tell stories. Because what everybody does, whether they're a writer or not, is to tell stories and to find a narrative sort of through line for what's going on in their lives. Things happen to us and they're actually really random. But our impulse is always to say, well, I'm the protagonist of my story. Who's the villain? What's the theme? What's the arc? We always sort of do this when we recount to ourselves what's happened in our day. And when we write fiction, or we write nonfiction, or we put something on the news, that same impulse takes over. So when I'm playing with stories, that's always the idea that I'm looking at. Fan fiction for me is something that I started doing as a little kid because I was watching stories on TV and I wanted to be in them. And I didn't have the awesome world of the internet to do fan fiction with. It was like me and a spiral bound notebook, and that was it. But the way, and then eventually I found the internet and there was this community of people and that was awesome. And the way that I approach story when I'm writing fan fiction, but I really do approach other types of writing this way too, is there's this idea in acting of given circumstances, which is that you have a character, and that character is a consistent individual who has certain quirks and habits and interests and likes and dislikes. And how they respond to a situation changes because of the situation. They don't change, their circumstances change. And when I write fan fiction in particular, I think about it as an acting improvisation exercise. I know who Harry Potter is in the story that J.K. Rowling told, but who is Harry Potter if his parents didn't die? He probably still has the same favorite foods. He probably still gravitates towards Ron as a friend. But is his self-esteem different? Is his ambition different? Is his willingness to confront evil different? The whole story plays out differently. If Hermione's parents aren't muggles, but are wizards, how does her story play out? She's still a girl in a world that's sexist. She's still wildly ambitious. Does she feel the same drive to prove herself? So it's this idea that when I'm writing fan fiction, I'm taking the given circumstances and I'm just changing them over and over and over again to find what the story is that I want to tell. And that means, if I'm playing with given circumstances, that when I start a story, I'm starting from the point of a question. I don't come into it saying, this is the story I have to tell. I want to know what would happen if. And my suspicion about fiction is that the point of a story isn't to tell you something, but it's to ask a question. And, I keep using the Harry Potter example, but I think it can be true of any property that you like to write in. I've written a lot of Glee fan fiction. What is Kurt Hummel's story if he doesn't get to leave Ohio? He's still the same guy, he just has a different set of problems now. And to me, that question of what people endure if their circumstances are different, or what people are able to achieve if their circumstances are different, are sort of what drives me as a writer. Fan fiction is sort of a weird animal because the first thing you'll get told about it if you do it, and I know that there are people in this room who've done fan fiction long before this workshop today, is people will tell you, well, you can't sell it, it's not professional writing, when are you going to write something real? And those are the nice things they'll say. There's plenty of other stuff, and we all know about that. And one of the things I really want to talk to you about today is a lot of that isn't true. Because I have a career as a professional writer because I write fan fiction. Even though a lot of what I publish is not fan fiction in its definition. And the way that that happened for me is that I was writing tons of Harry Potter fan fiction, and I get a call from a friend of mine. I'm actually on the set of Law & Order shooting something, and a friend of mine calls me. She's like, there's some guy on Craigslist, and he wants somebody to write a book about Harry Potter, and you should, send him an email. And I'm like, okay. So I get off set, I email this guy, I'm like, you want someone to write a book about Harry Potter? I have a journalism degree, and I've written tons of Harry Potter fan fiction. You should hire me. This is the stupidest thing I've ever said in a cover letter, ever, just for the record. And the guy calls me up, he's like, hey, come into my office, let's meet. So I go into his office, and he's like, so what is this fan fiction thing? I'm like, well, I write Harry Potter books for all of us who are waiting for the real Harry Potter books, and people follow me on the internet, and I have fans. Even though you've never heard of me, I have fans, and if you give me this book deal, I can sell books, because I come with fans. And he's like, all right, let me Google this fan fiction thing. I don't know what you're talking about. He Googles this fan fiction thing, and then we have to have a conversation about porn on the internet. Not comfortable. But eventually, I get the book deal, and he says, okay, I need a manuscript from you in 3 weeks. Yes, all the professional writers in the room are laughing. If anybody ever says to you, here is your contract, I need a book in 3 weeks, the first thing you do is say yes, because somebody just offered you a contract. The second thing you do is cry. Because the worst experience you will ever have is writing a book in 3 weeks. But I did, and it's Harry Potter and the book of Harry Potter, Trifles, Trivias, and Particularities. It's a trivia book that also has lots of text in it about the fan culture and also about the mythology that J.K. Rowling used to write Harry Potter. And all of that information is only information I have access to because I'm a fan, because I sat down and I looked at these stories and I said, well, what is J.K. Rowling really doing when she makes Remus Lupin a werewolf? Is that an allegory about AIDS? Is that an allegory about poverty? What is happening there? And the questions I asked as a fan fiction writer were the questions I was then able to ask as a non-fiction writer and as a critic. So this came out, I earned back my advance, which is awesome. It sold its 8,000 copies. We did not reprint, it's still available as an ebook. Another piece of random advice, and this is random, your copy editor is the most awesome person in the world, but never trust them. Because if you look at the spine of my book, and 8,000 of these sold, it says the book of Harry Potter, Trifles, Trivias, and Particularities. I got 2 F's in Trifles, and I named my first book 8,000 copies, Trifles. But because I wrote that, I then got invited to conferences, and I got to talk about Harry Potter and fandom and why it's amazing and why people go to Harry Potter conferences and then, like, you know, get engaged while cosplaying like Remus Lupin and Tonks and amazing things like this that I've seen. And it meant that I got to network with writers and editors and other people, and it gave me an opportunity to do more writing about the fandoms that I love. And one of the fandoms that I love more than anything is Doctor Who. Do we have any Doctor Who people? Okay, yeah, I see a little Doctor Who shimmy. Awesome. So my background with Doctor Who is I came to it with New Who, and then my very good friend Collie and I started writing a Torchwood fan fiction. And it turned out to be 200,000 words of Torchwood fan fiction. And it took over a year, and it was about loss and death, because that's actually what Doctor Who is about, because it has people who live forever, and when you live forever, it means the people around you don't. So we took this show that is this general audience, all ages show, and we're like, well, how can we make it this very adult story about growing up and losing people that you love? And in the middle of writing that, both of us dealt with a lot of really intense family stuff and loss and health dramas in our own families. So this story that was just a what-if question became in the process this story about our lives. And we had hundreds of people reading along with us and offering suggestions, and then we got to the end of it, and we looked at each other, and we're both writers who write professionally, and went, oh my God, the most important thing I ever write, maybe this piece of fan fiction I can never get paid for, because we felt like that was how much of an impact it had made on us, and it had made on readers. And a lot of our readers were people we knew in publishing who were like, write a book, write a book, write a book. So we looked at each other going, oh my God, we have to write a book with like our own characters and our own world. How do we do that? Well, and this is something we're still working on, but the first thing we thought to ourselves is, well, let's go back to talking about Harry Potter. Maybe Harry Potter has the answer. Harry Potter actually kind of has the answer to everything. One of the things that we discovered in going back and talking about Harry Potter that, you know, I have all this trivia in my head about, is if you count every named character in the Harry Potter universe, there's a ratio of about 3 to 2 boys to girls. there's this huge gender gap. And I can do one of two things with that. I can go, J.K. Rowling lives in the sexist world that I live in and is more prone to writing boys doing things than girls doing things. Or I can say that this is a problem internal to the story, that there's something wrong with the wizarding world, that there's this huge gender imbalance. Why is this happening? So Holly and I started looking at that. We were done with Harry Potter, right? It gave us our question, but then we're like, what happens in a magical universe where there's a radical gender imbalance? And the gender imbalance is happening because of something magic is doing to people. How does that society function? What conflicts does that society have? How are people's relationships affected? And then from that, we were able to build this set of characters and a world that we're playing with and are slowly writing an original novel that has now turned into an original trio of novels because we don't write short. And one day, hopefully, that will see the light of day. But that has been this very remarkable writing process. And while all of this was going on, other writers and publishers and editors we knew came to me and said, we've seen not just your story, but the way you talk about your story. Do you want to write something for an anthology? So since that, and we wrote that story probably in about 2009, 2010, I want to say, I've been asked to contribute to dozens of anthologies about pop culture topics and about how they tell stories and about how those stories have meaning for me. So one of the things I was in is this is Whedonistas. This is a book of essays where women talk about how they've been influenced by the works of Joss Whedon. So that includes Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which I'm sure I see the Buffy nod happening over there. It includes Dollhouse, it includes his movies. And I attributed many things on Doctor Who, both to academic publications. I did something on how journalists are used as characters in Doctor Who to make the fiction look more true. And I have this coming out in June, although Amazon's shipping early, which is called Queers Dig Time Lords, and it's about how gay people respond to the queer content in Doctor Who. And what I've been able to do is take this fan fiction impulse of the stories I'm not seeing on screen, but the original content is hinting to me is there, and then talk about them and talk about how they have meaning to my own story. And in this recent essay, what happens is Doctor Who has this character, Captain Jack Harkness. He can't die. He comes to New York through Ellis Island in like 1897 or something, and then lives in America, even though he's a guy from the 51st century. And in one of the episodes of the show, he's just come to New York, he's come through Ellis Island, he has this boyfriend who's just emigrated from Italy, but it's like 1920 and being gay is not okay. And they have an encounter with some mobsters who want to kill them. And in the course of this event, one of the mobsters describes him as Finocchi. Finocchi is this word in Italian that technically means a bulb of fennel, but it's actually a really offensive gay slur if you are, like me, Sicilian. I'd never heard that word on TV. I heard it in my father's house growing up. And it was this moment of recognition that suddenly the story that wasn't going to go down that path, that wasn't going to really talk about what this meant, I was on screen in a way I had never been on screen before. And it gave me this opportunity to write a story that wasn't fan fiction, but that talked about the hidden story that was there and what meaning it had. So if you're somebody who loves fan fiction, the point of all of this is whenever somebody says to you, when are you going to write something real, or your fan fiction can't be published, or it doesn't matter, they're wrong. Because first of all, you're a writer if you write stuff. You don't have to be published. You don't have to decide you want to do it for money. Humans tell stories. In the Victorian era, women got together and had tea parties and rewrote the tales of King Arthur for each other and read them aloud. They wrote fantasies about Lancelot. This drive we have to take our favorite characters and put them into situations that make us happier are things that we have done for hundreds and thousands of years. It's a basic function of us as people. So the idea that fan fiction has to be a stepping stone to something else, not true. It's just a thing that we do and we're allowed to want to do it awesomely. If you do want it to be a stepping stone to something else, it can be. One of the ways that it can be is it teaches you how to write. It teaches you how to structure. It lets you play with certain elements Well, not having to worry about other elements. Oh, somebody already did my world building. Somebody already physically described my characters. Okay, I'll worry about plot here. Or I'll worry about the sound of dialogue and trying to match how I hear somebody speak in the book that's already published or the TV show. The other thing fan fiction does is it gives us exposure. It gives us exposure to what it's like to have fans. It gives us exposure to the first editors we may have. In fan fiction we call them beta readers. It gives us access to constructive criticism. More than that, it gives us access to people who are like, oh my god, I love your story. Because the reality of writing is you do it alone. And then you do it alone some more, and then you submit it somewhere, and like 3 years later it comes out and you are done with character. And you didn't really have a cheerleader. In fan fiction, you get cheerleaders all day long, and it can be that fuel that keeps you going. There are stories that I'm sure many of you have heard. Anybody heard of Cassie Clare? Oh, I was going to say, this cannot be a room without people who have not heard of Cassie Clare. Okay. Cassie Clare was this woman who wrote a very, very popular fan fiction series, and it was so popular she got a book deal, and now they're being made into movies, and her life is wonderful. And a lot of people think if they just write the most popular fan fiction story ever, that will happen to them. Well, it could. Cassie's not the only person it's happened to. But that is your goal for fan fiction? Maybe that'll happen. Maybe it won't. It probably won't. But can fan fiction be a thing where you happen to bump into other professional writers who engage in this activity and want to be your friend or your mentor or hook you up with a cool gig or introduce you to an editor who asks you to write for an anthology? Absolutely. The other thing is this idea that you can't publish fan fiction refers to stuff that's in copyright. There is lots of fan fiction that is professionally published, and we just don't call it that because the thing that it started with is out of copyright. One of those big examples is Historic Materials. Has anybody read that series? Okay, it's the same people over and over. Historic Materials is basically somebody took Milton's Paradise Lost and then wrote an amazing fantasy world based on the themes of that writing, which is hundreds of years old. There's also Wide Sargasso Sea, which is a retelling of Jane Eyre, pulling from a very different perspective in the books. So the idea that building off of somebody else's fiction is immediately this thing where you can't do it professionally isn't true. What happens in a television writer's room? You have a showrunner who created an idea, pitched an idea, and then hired 12 people who sit in a room and argue and write fan fiction about the showrunner's idea for a living. So the concept of fan fiction as not marketable or not professionally relevant is not true. And that's just sort of the big thing that I always want to say about that. That sort of winds up my fan fiction is awesome and my life is random story. And mostly what I want to hear about is what you guys are interested in, what questions you have, what you're trying to do, and anything that I can do to help or entertain for the next few minutes that we do this.
I can get us started. I'm kind of interested in the difference between the fan fiction and then like what Cassie Clare is doing and writing something that's totally her own, starting in fan fiction and moving to something that's publishable, that's not sort of based in someone else's work. And I'm sort of wondering about how you sort of navigate that transition and how that can happen. Like when does it, how you take someone else's world and make it fully your own.
Well, part of what you're describing there is something we affectionately call in fandom filing off the serial numbers. And what happens there sometimes is you write something and you're like, oh god, this is really amazing. Can I just like change a few things in the world building and have it stand as an original novel because I already did so much that moved it away from the source. And that happens sometimes, and it's often said derogatorily, but I think it's ridiculous because the fact is there are only so many stories out there, and we do tell the same stories over and over and over again. You can say that Harry Potter is fully original and people who write Harry Potter fan fiction can't write their original work. Or you can say that Harry Potter is the same exact story as Star Wars, because it is. Because it's a boy who is isolated and alone, has to save the universe from an evil only he is connected to. And it's not like Star Wars was the first story that went there either. So the idea that finding an original story, especially when you're really latched on to a story that's already out there and been published that's meaningful to you is hard or has to be so radically different. You know, we have archetypes for a reason. So I don't think that the challenge is necessarily as big as people think. What I tried to do, and I was recently on a trip, and I was in Paris for work, and I had this great idea for something that would be an awesome Kurt Blaine story in Glee fandom. And then I went, wait, why does this have to be a Glee story? This is just an awesome story about two people meeting under really screwed up circumstances in a country where they don't know the language. I could totally turn this into a novel. And now that's sort of sitting on my desk as an outline. I don't know if I care enough to do it. That's, you know, a novel's a big commitment. Maybe I'll just be like, actually, I want to spend 3 hours writing a Kurt Blaine story about this and be done with it and get it out of my head. But for me, the transition always comes from, I've had this awesome fan fiction idea. Is fan fiction the best venue for it? And sometimes the answer is yes, but when it isn't, that's when it turns into its own world.
Sure. Can you talk a little bit more about your sort of day and like how you're sort of balancing all these different jobs that you have and how that affects your writing process?
My day is very strange. My day job, like I said, I work for an institute that does media analysis, and what we do is we examine every report in newspapers and TV from around the world about how certain people and companies and ideas are covered in the media. Because while journalism is true, and my background is originally in journalism, it's still telling a story. It's still structuring a narrative. And if I look at how US television covers certain issues versus UK television or French television or South African television or Indian television, the same story gets told in radically different ways. So the first part of my day, that company is based in Europe. So I get up very early in the morning and I deal with that. And I look at the data that my company has and the reports that we have to do. I do a lot of speaking at conferences for them and just sort of look at how this is happening. So I write a lot of academic papers in the morning about how the news tells stories. And that's the first half of my day, every day. It is, to be really honest, completely interspersed with me like reading Tumblr, reading LJ, being obsessed with the internet. Because for me, writing is about being a pattern recognition machine. And what other people see as distraction and procrastination is I want as much information coming at me about the things I care about at once so I can take those pieces and rearrange them. And that's how I write fan fiction, but that's also how I write original fiction, and that's also how I write criticism, is taking these disparate ideas. And usually the second half of my day is what I'm working on related to pop culture things. So that'll be stuff for anthologies, that'll be my own fiction, that'll be criticism I'm doing that's preparing talks. I have a talk about real person fanfic, which is when people do fan fiction about actors, that I'm doing in the Netherlands this summer. So I have that I'm working on in the afternoons. I have a bunch of stuff coming out in anthologies this year. I'm working on that in the afternoons. And then my evenings are inhaling pop culture. And that can be anything from the TV shows I always watch because I'm into them and I'm working on stuff related to them, whether it's fanfic or paying work, or listening to music, or reading, or having people over. For me, the real genesis of being creative is I don't watch TV alone. I watch TV with like a cadre of other fan fiction writers, some of whom will be like, oh man, but I hate this show. I love watching TV with people who hate the thing I love. Because if they hate it smart, what they do is they force me to stick up for it. You know, if they're just like, I hate this, it's stupid, okay, that person's useless, don't be friends with that person. But the person who's like, I don't understand why this always happens and these people can't think their way out of a paper bag, why do they make that choice over and over again? That's a great question. Why do they do that? And I can sit down and write a piece of criticism about why that TV show is dysfunctional for that reason. Or I can write fanfic that fixes it. Or I can go, now if I were going to write a TV show about that, it would look like this totally other thing, and then I'm off on my own project. So for me, it's about inhaling media constantly with other people. Yeah?
Can you talk a little bit about copyright and legal issues? I mean, obviously you can use since Harry Potter's real name and you're like doing your
Right.
if you were writing about One Direction, would you run into copyright issues?
Okay, so I'm not a lawyer. Let me just preface with that. When you go to journalism school, they actually make you take all these crazy law classes so you can pretend to be a lawyer on the internet. Please don't pretend to be a lawyer on the internet because people will fight with you. It sucks. But criticism is something that you can always get away with. Satire is something you can pretty much always get away with. And when it comes to the idea of One Direction and stuff like this, there's two issues. I think there's an ethical issue, and I think there's a legal issue. And I think the viewpoint that solves both of those is when you're dealing with talking about famous people, you're not talking about their real lives. You have no access to their real lives. You don't actually know what they're like in the morning before they leave the house. The thing you have access to is their persona. And their persona may include who they're dating, who they're flirting with, what they wear, what they say their hobbies are, how they move, how they talk, and all of those things may be very similar to the private life you're never going to see, or they may be so radically different it's absurd. And I have a lot of friends in entertainment, some of whom are very successful, and the persona gaps vary, but I think if you do want to talk about persona, whether as a fanfic author or as a critic, it's a very easy thing to do. I actually have a piece that I've been shopping around forever, and it is